Good evening, everyone. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Western Michigan Cooley Law School and the Western Michigan Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine, I am really pleased to welcome you tonight to our joint symposium. And we've entitled the symposium tonight, For All Americans, and yes, that's a question mark at the end of my voice, the future of the Affordable Care Act. It is really my huge pleasure and my pride to be the moderator of this event. And we are hoping that with the affiliations of Western and the collaboration with the law schools and the medical school that we will have more than one opportunity to present something of this nature of educational, community education, bringing people out and asking tough questions and getting answers with some really smart people and some really wonderful attendees like you. So thank you so much for attending. My name is Jane Markey, and I'm a judge of the Michigan Court of Appeals. And the Court of Appeals in the state of Michigan is the second highest court in the state. Now, I'm not quite sure how I got here because I'm a bit of a fish out of water tonight because I'm usually sitting quietly, listening diligently to oral arguments and lawyers giving me all their best. But tonight it's the other way around, so I'll see what I can do here. For 26 years, I've served as a judge, 22 on the Michigan Court of Appeals. But perhaps the reason I'm standing here is because for 22 years, I've also served on the board of directors for Western Michigan University Cooley Law School. I'm one of their graduates, and a very proud one at that. Joining us tonight is our keynote speaker and the author of For All Americans, former Congressman Bart Stupak, who is also a board member with me on the Cooley Board of Directors. We also have Professor Lisa DeMoss from Cooley and James Falahi from Bronson Healthcare Group and Tyler Gibb, who's on the Western Michigan Medical School faculty. Now I'll provide some more information about them a little bit later. So what is our goal tonight? Why are we here and what do we hope to accomplish with this symposium? Well, we're going to have three where questions that we're going to delve into, and I want you to keep in mind when we're going through all of this because your participation is going to be a big part of it. And the first thing we're going to be talking about and thinking about is where are we as a country and where have we been as a country in terms of health care for the citizens of this great nation that we all live in? So where are we now? And third, where will we be going in the future? Where should we be going? So keep these in mind, think about your questions, and then we're going to kick off with our Congressman giving us a speech on some of his thoughts, but let me tell you a little bit about him first. Sorry, Bart, because you're going to have to endure this. Bart Stupak is a former United States Congressman, and he's a partner in Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Group. As a congressman to Michigan's first congressional district for 18 years, Mr. Stupak developed a deep understanding of issues that directly affected his constituents, including matters related to energy, healthcare, telecommunications, and international trade. As an attorney at Venable, he's in a unique position to provide clients with well-informed, extensive counsel that is based on a thorough knowledge of these industries and related legislation. While in Congress, Mr. Stupak served on the Energy and Commerce Committee for 16 years. During his tenure on the Energy and Commerce Committee, he served on a number of subcommittees, including Health, Energy and the Environment, Communications, Technology and the Internet, Consumer Protection, Commerce and Trade, and Oversight and Investigations. As chairman of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, Mr. Stupak helped lead investigations into key issues such as physical and cybersecurity breaches at U.S. nuclear labs, food and drug safety, insurance company rescissions of insurance policies. He also played an important role in the passage of H.R. 3590, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010. Additionally, Mr. Stupak has served on the Armed Services, Government Reform, and Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committees, probably his favorite since he's from the UP. Prior to joining the United States House of Representatives, Mr. Stupak worked in private practice in Michigan, and he began his career in public service as a police officer in Escanaba. He continued his career in law enforcement as a Michigan State police trooper, probably only pulling some of us over 3 or 4 times. until he was medically retired due to an injury sustained during the line of duty. He also served in the Michigan House of Representatives. In spring 2011, Mr. Stupak was a fellow at the Institute of Politics, Harvard University, John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's a fellow of the Alumni Advisory Council, Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy Government School of Government, Harvard, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's been on the board of directors of Cooley Law School since 2012, the Ethics Resource Center, Board of Directors, Washington, D.C., 2011, and Leadership Advisory Committee for the Facility for Rare Isotope Beams at the Michigan State University, East Lansing, Michigan. And that's, of course, going to be the deep topic he's going to talk to us about tonight. That is a very amazing and interesting biography. I'm proud to call Bart Stupak a friend, and we are very, very fortunate to have him tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So here you go, Bart.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, but if I may, I want to take a point of personal privilege. Way in the back, the young lady way back there, that's my wife, Lori. She should be pointed out not just because she's my wife, but because she also encouraged me to write this book for all Americans, and she assisted in the editing and the co-authoring of the book. So she had a great role not only in my life, but also in the first book. And she says only book, but thank you to Western Michigan Cooley Law School and the medical school for hosting us here this evening. And we had a quick tour of the medical school, and you have a fabulous facility here, and I'm sure it's going to produce some great physicians and health professionals that we need in this country. It's an honor to share this evening with my friend, Court of Appeals Judge Markey, and our distinguished panelists. I also wish to thank all those who helped make this event a possibility tonight. I usually begin my presentations by asking for your understanding, because my name is Bart Stupak and I'm a recovering politician. But I also want you to know that throughout my legislative career, there was never any doubt in my mind that healthcare was a right for all Americans and not just a privilege for those few people who could afford it. Therefore, in an attempt to predict the future of the Affordable Care Act, I think we should first go back and let's take a look at history and how did the healthcare evolve in this country. And it started back really in 1912 when President Teddy Roosevelt, he was then running underneath the Bull Moose platform, actually advocated for healthcare for low-income workers. And why low-income workers? Because low-income workers would go to work when they were deathly ill. And they would spread the disease or the illness to the rest of their co-workers, and everybody would be sick and productivity would come to an end. But low-income workers could not afford to take days off. They didn't have sick leave back in 1912. So that was really the first proposal. And then 20 years later, we had the Great Depression in the early 1930s. And Franklin Roosevelt actually called for national health care to cover all Americans. He saw what the Depression was doing to Americans. It stripped us of our jobs and our wealth, and that health care was such a critical part, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said it should be part of his program. FDR's plan was to include publicly funded health care program in his Social Security legislation. But because of political opposition, the health care part of Social Security was stripped out to salvage the Social Security program, which lifted so many seniors out of economic calamity. 10 years later, during World War II, the federal government instituted wage and price controls. And that was very important in an effort to curb inflation while we tried to prosecute the war, World War II. That's the first time when employers started to think we'll give our workers health care since we can't increase wages because of price controls. So that's how we first started with employer-sponsored health care to cover employees, which eventually most Americans today still receive their health care through their employer. Following World War II, President Harry Truman actually called for universal health care for all Americans. That was Harry Truman's platform. However, the Republicans controlled the Congress, and they refused to take up the health care cause. It was not until 1965, Lyndon Johnson, then with a large Democratic majority, actually passed Medicare, which is health insurance for our senior citizens. And then 5 years later, 1970, Michigan's own Congresswoman, Martha Griffiths, was the first person to introduce a national health care program. Griffith's plan was truly a single-payer plan. It was to be paid for by taxes and general revenue from the federal government. Also in 1970, Republican Senator Jacob Javits of New York, along with Nelson Rockefeller, advocated a Medicare for all, extend Medicare for all citizens. And that plan was actually introduced not only with Javits, but also Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. Therefore, 40 years ago, members of Congress introduced legislation to do three things: Medicare for all, or a single payer system, and they encourage employers to provide health insurance, not just for their employees, but also the families of those employees. Even President Richard Nixon, the 6 years he was in office, had three different health care proposals. President Simpson, Ford, Carter, the Bushes, all proposed their own version of health care coverage for Americans. But none of these proposals were ever taken seriously by the United States Congress. In 1992, Democratic presidential nominee Bill Clinton campaigned for national health care for all Americans. I joined Governor Clinton and promised voters of the 1st Congressional District of Michigan that if I was elected, I would fight for national health care. Then Governor Clinton was elected. First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton chaired his health care initiative and actually introduced to Congress the Health Security Act. The Health Security Act was debated and considered by the Energy and Commerce Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. The committee vote to send the bill, the Health Security Act, to the full House of Representatives ended up in a tie vote. Tie vote, therefore the proposal fails, and it died in committee. In 1994, the Republicans took back control of Congress for the first time in 40 years, and all serious efforts to pass health care ended. Out of power, congressional Democrats, and by now I was in Congress then, as in my second term, we turned our attention to advocating for a Patient's Bill of Rights. The Patient Bill of Rights was an effort to provide greater protections for consumers when they dealt with health care coverage. The Patient's Bill of Rights had bipartisan support, but neither the House or the Senate would pass the legislation. Congressional Democrats regained control in 2007. We introduced numerous bills for national health care. However, just prior to the 2008 presidential election, the national economy imploded and America slipped into a deep economic recession. President Obama's first legislative priority was to stabilize the economy and to stop the massive loss of jobs. We were losing 800,000 jobs a month. But in that, we didn't put forth an economic stimulus package, which actually cost taxpayers almost $1 trillion. Besides trying to create new jobs and new projects, the economic stimulus package extended unemployment benefits, and for one of the few times, we also extended health insurance and maintained the health insurance that laid-off workers had. So while they were laid off, we still paid their health insurance premium under COBRA. With the collapse of the financial markets back in 2008, 2009, Americans lost 40% of their financial investments and retirement benefits. Health insurance premiums soared through the roof, and many insurance companies simply stopped providing health insurance. As chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I stepped up my investigations into the insurance industry's practices of rescinding individual health care policies without cause when the beneficiary became ill, offering low-cost insurance policies that provided little medical coverage when families needed it the most, and the canceling of health insurance when an employee of a small business became seriously ill. In 2009, while we found ourselves in a deep economic recession that stole our health and our wealth, we also found that 62% of all the nation's bankruptcies were due to medical expenses. Incredibly, of those 62% bankrupt petitions, 78 of those petitioners had health insurance, but it didn't cover the bill, so they filed bankruptcy. At the same time, if you look from 2000 to 2007, wages for the American worker went up 4.6%. Premiums for health insurance went up 78.2%. Even more tragic, 45,000 Americans, or 1 every 12 minutes, died because they did not have access to basic health care. Our investigations not only exposed these cruel facts, but also revealed what many Americans already knew. They could not, their employer could not, and the government could no longer afford health care, nor could we afford to be without it. By 2009, Democrats had built the largest majorities we've had in the House and Senate in a long, long time. And for a brief moment in 2009, we actually had 60 votes in the Senate to prevent a filibuster of any health care legislation. And I said, with the election of Barack Obama as our 44th president, Democrats vowed to pass health care for all Americans. The key House committee to write the health care legislation was in the Energy and Commerce Committee. In my book, as Jane pointed out, For All Americans, Chapter 23 actually details the comprehensive investigation that was conducted by the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. The Affordable Care Act includes many of the legislative findings, and that we ended the practice of unjust practice of rescinding health care policies without cause, requiring all health insurance policies to cover essential benefits, and capping out-of-pocket expenses so families did not end up in bankruptcy. During the health care debate, I was constantly reminded of my original promise to the voters of Michigan that I would provide health care coverage for all Americans. I also believed that the federal government should maintain its 32-year policy of not paying for, promoting, or encouraging abortions. My belief in providing health care for all Americans, and my belief in the sanctity of life, and that no federal funding should be used to pay for abortions, resulted in a very personal, ethical dilemma that I struggled with throughout the consideration of the Affordable Care Act. My personal struggle and my numerous attempts to reconcile these two often conflicting issues is the dominant theme throughout my book, For All Americans. For All Americans is not an autobiography. The book explains in detail the strategic, political, and the moral issues surrounding the final passage of the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare. My strong Catholic faith, my life experiences and upbringing in northern Michigan, and my work in the Michigan State Police, Michigan Legislature, and the U.S. Congress all helped shape my position on the issues that I felt most passionate about. The book details the negotiations I had with the Democratic Party leaders, my conversations with President Obama, and the secluded negotiations on the executive order and the final votes for the passage of the Affordable Care Act. The political shenanigans, the late-night negotiations, the political and personal threats were overcome by a small but very determined group of Democrats determined to pass health care for all Americans. There was one more promise that I mentioned in the book. On election night in November of 2008, I promised my most important constituent, my wife Lori, that with the election of Barack Obama, we would pass health care and I would retire from Congress. And I kept my promise. For All Americans was a book that was almost not written, to tell you the truth. Immediately following the Affordable Care Act, the staff and some of my other friends who saw the turmoil of those 15 months that I went through urged me to write a book. So I contacted a respected literary agent in Washington, D.C., and he told me, "You have no book, you have no story, no one cares." I said, okay. So I went up to Harvard, as they said, and I accepted a fellowship up at the Kennedy School. And there I didn't get the book out of my mind, I drafted an outline of a manuscript, and I just set it aside. And then over the next few years, I watched and listened as healthcare experts and members of Congress explained the Affordable Care Act, how it came into being, and the rationale behind the act. These explanations failed to tell the complete story of how the ACA was passed, and some of the explanations were just simply false. Upon hearing these inaccurate, incomplete explanations, I'd get mad, I'd sit down, take my notes, and write a chapter, and then set it aside. Then I'd hear someone else say something that I did or didn't do, or someone else did that wasn't right, so I'd sit down, write another chapter. And I did that for 3, 4, 5 years. And then in 2015, two things happened. First, Harvard came back to me and said, we really liked what you talked about, the moral and ethical dilemma you had in trying to prevent federal funding for abortions, but at the same time, trying to pass the Affordable Care Act because 45,000 Americans die every year because they don't have access to basic health care. And we liked how you approached the subject, how you finally worked it out. And we always do moral and ethical courses on the death penalty, but we'd like to do it on what you did on health care. So would you work with us? And they developed a case study on the ethical dilemma that I confronted throughout the debate on the Affordable Care Act. So we actually put together a 30-page documentary. It's called Bart Stupak Walks a Tight Line Between Obamacare and Abortion. And the students took great interest in it, and now it's a required course in 4 undergrad courses and also in a graduate course. But at the same time I was working with Harvard to develop this case study, the BBC came to me, British Broadcasting Corporation. They said, we're doing a documentary, 4-part documentary on the Obama years. Part 2 is going to be on health care. And as we've conducted interviews around Washington, everyone said we should talk to you. So they came and interviewed me, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And every time I'd say something, they'd say, well, that's not what happened. That's not what so-and-so said. And what proof do you have? And I had pulled out my banker's box, being an attorney and a former cop. I document everything. And I'd pull out my documents. And they'd say, you're right. Then I'd pull out my document, the fact sheet that I sent to Rahm Emanuel with the technical corrections bill. And they said, that's not what Rahm says. And I said, yeah, I know. But anyways, they went back to London. They put together their documentary. But they said, we never do this. But they sent me 60 pages of the 3 interviews they did of me. And they said, you really got to tell your story. So they sent me the 60 pages, all transcribed the interview. And they sent this note. It said, this was Sarah Walling, I hope we helped in some way to encourage you to start writing your remarkable story. You tell it so well. And to just give me a little bit more incentive, they sent me a clip of part 2. And there's my good friend, Rahm Emanuel, right? I served with him in Congress. He's the president's chief of staff. And Rahm is saying to the camera, the executive order. Bart Stupak and I did that. He sat in that chair. I sat right here. We had his coffee table between us. And within one afternoon, we completed and negotiated the executive order that allowed the Affordable Care Act to pass. And that's really great because neither one of us are an attorney. Well, problem is, Rahm and I never sat down to negotiate an executive order, nor was I in the room he talked about. And it was negotiated with a small group of right-to-life Democrats over 3 days in Congressman Mike Doyle's hideaway on the 5th floor of the Cannon building. And so Rahm's version is false and not even close to being true. And Rahm seemed to forget, at that time, I had been an attorney for 36 years. But Rahm had the facts. So that's what's sort of a little incentive. So anyways, we did finish up the transcript, Lori and I, in about 18 months. We presented it to a couple of publishers. And again, the publishers were very kind. Well written, very interesting. But your book isn't to the right on the political spectrum. It's not on the left. Therefore, you have no audience. We won't publish your book. Finally, I tried one more publisher, the 4th publisher, who jumped at it, and we got the book out. But we didn't plan to release it this summer. It just happened that way. The book was done. The Senate was talking about repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. So the timing just sort of worked out. The reviews on Amazon have been kind. The reviewers described the book as a dramatic page-turner and a very easy read. While the book is being sold commercially, we're actually working with some universities, some professors who really want to use the book as sort of like an academic book. They said I do a great job of explaining like what a motion to recommit was. They always knew what a motion to recommit was, but they didn't understand the political or the legislative significance behind a motion to recommit. And there's some things in there, but they say you tell it well. But tonight's topic is where do we go from here? Where are we here today in 2007, late October? I've always said, and any Congress has the right to repeal an act that another Congress does or another law they pass. Any Congress can do that. And if they repeal the Affordable Care Act, that's their constitutional right. But what they'll never do is take away the right now of the American people, because the legacy of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act is we now have an expectation that we're entitled to health insurance and health care, and I do believe it is a basic human right. There is no perfect legislation. I'm disappointed in the last 7 years, the discussions on the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare have been political and not on policy and not on substance. What we should do, we should stabilize the markets, and we should fully fund the Affordable Care Act. We should reverse President Trump's executive order 10 days ago that took away the ACA's cost-sharing reductions. We should enforce the individual mandate. President Trump says, yeah, you got an individual mandate, but you don't have to pay attention to it. We're not enforcing it. There's no fine or cost. We should restore the tax cuts that were used to pay for the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act did not add to the deficit. It was paid for. The suntan tax, the medical device tax, the tax on people who make more than $250,000. You'll see that repealed next week, or attempt to repeal it next week in the tax bill that they plan on presenting next week. We should restore funding for the navigators who help people sign up for the appropriate health care bill for them. Payments for medical services should be based on quality-based outcomes, not on how many procedures or how many doctors you see. You should be paid for the quality, not the quantity that you consume. And we should fully fund those co-ops who are only funded at half, 50%, and they've been criticized for failing. You know, there is a bipartisan agreement to stabilize the market. There are 12 Republican senators on the bill. There's 12 Democratic senators on that legislation. So if all 48 Democrats vote for it and the 12 Republicans who co-sponsored, that's 60. You can end the filibuster, and the thing they've been trying to do, stabilize the insurance markets, could be accomplished. Unfortunately, Mitch McConnell has indicated he has no intention of bringing the bill to the floor at this time. Hopefully we can change that. Finally, Paul Ryan has also said that he doesn't think he's going to allow a vote on that proposal either, because his Freedom Caucus, as they call it, 150 members of the House of Representatives, are against it. So we got a long ways to go. Again, they're not trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act based on policy. They're doing it strictly on politics. Other reforms that we should do to the Affordable Care Act that was actually in the House bill, but we lost when it went to the Senate. We should have the Secretary of Health and Human Services negotiate lower drug prices on behalf of all Americans. The federal government is the largest consumer of prescription drugs. We have the most purchasing power, but we're not allowed to use it for our advantage and the advantage of the taxpayers. And I really do believe we should remove the antitrust exemption for insurance. It was in the House bill. Again, the Senate refused to do it. And finally, I think there should be transparency on pricing by all healthcare providers, not just hospitals, not just doctors, but all healthcare providers, so you, the consumer, can actually do smart shopping for your healthcare needs and benefits. Now with that, I know we're going to have questions tonight. I really do look forward to it. I enjoyed the evening, and I look forward to your questions. I'm sure they're not going to be easy, and if not, I'll just yield to the judge. Thank you.
Sometimes the greatest compliment comes from someone who's more on the other side of the aisle, and as an elected official myself, I've always leaned a little more right. But I have to tell you, I'm reading the book, and it is a page-turner. And Bart, there are few people I've encountered in my political career for whom I've developed more respect for his integrity, his ethics, and his word is his word. And I think we are really privileged to have someone of Bart Stupak's quality and experience to be with us today. And this audience is probably particularly appreciative because of the sophistication of your interest and the fact that you're here. So if I were on the other side of you, I would always listen carefully as well. So thanks, Bart. We really appreciated it. We have several other panel members, and the first person I'm going to introduce is Professor Lisa DeMoss, and give you a little bit of quick background on Lisa. Her experience and expertise is in insurance, healthcare financing, health insurance, corporate compliance, corporate board governance, and business ethics. She joined Western Michigan University Cooley Law School in 2010 as a visiting professor and as director of the Master of Laws program in insurance. Lisa, would you like to give us a little bit of an opening statement?
Sure. I'd be very happy to do so. This is an area of interest, obviously, for me and for everyone in the room. As I was thinking about my remarks this evening, I was trying to come up with a single word that would best capture the characteristics of the insurance market today. Chaotic, insecure, unstable, paralyzed by uncertainty, and I honestly couldn't come up with a single descriptor that fit all of the circumstances. Like everything else connected with healthcare, when we talk about health insurance and health insurance reform under the Affordable Care Act, it's complicated. And so we're really talking about multiple markets involving different products that are sold in different states, each of which has a different foundational insurance market and regulatory environment. So it's hard to universally characterize exactly what the state of health insurance is today across America. But what I do know, what I've come to conclude is that we are a market characterized by uncertainty, and certainly with the new administration that has come in beginning at in January of 2017. That uncertainty has certainly not been resolved and has increased, and that increased anxiety over not so much what the ultimate substance will be, because I think the insurance companies are resilient, they're adaptive. I think they need to know what the rules are. They're corporations, just like any other corporations. They're profit-oriented. It's very difficult for any corporation, particularly insurance companies, to turn on a dime in reaction to brand new concepts in the marketplace. And so certainly the fact of extraordinary uncertainty with regard to what the future will bring weighs very heavily on the minds of the insurance actuaries who are responsible for setting the rates. And at the moment, you all know what repeal and replace means conceptually. None of us knows what the replace part of that concept portends. I don't think we're going to have to worry about that in the near distant future, because it doesn't appear that the political moment is today to introduce legislation that will attract sufficient votes for the replace part, at least, of the concept. So instead, we are clearly embarking upon what I call a review and replace process, as evidenced by some of the recent pronouncements in the form of executive orders that are coming out of the White House. And so there's been a lot of uncertainty about what's on the president's mind as he attempts to lead Congress in a particular direction. And frankly, he flip-flops on the issues, and so I'm not sure anybody really knows what the end game is in terms of his health policy, but he's given us a little bit of an inkling this month exactly with regard to a couple of matters where he issued executive orders. The one executive order was a carry through on a threat that he made previously to withdraw funding for the cost sharing reduction component of the premiums that support the purchases on the individual health insurance markets. And so when we talk about all of the turmoil in the markets, we're really focused not so much on the market where the majority of Americans obtain access to health insurance, as the Congressman noted, which is through their employers, but instead we're focused on that 10% of the insured private market in America that purchases their product through individual policies. And that market has never been profitable, particularly for insurance companies. It's always been the stepchild of the insurance product portfolio at any insurance company. It's very, very hard to make a reasonable profit on an individual line of business. Why? Because it's essentially a retail type of product where you have one-off marketing, advertising, customer servicing, and it's very expensive to administer. And so it's really, really hard to make a profit and maintain a reasonably priced premium. Moreover, the individual market tends to be a victim of a principle in insurance law that insurance companies assiduously try and avoid, and that is the principle of adverse selection. And so typically, people in the individual market don't begin to shop for insurance until they need to use it. And that violates all of the basic tenets of insurance. Insurance is all about developing a balanced risk pool. And you need a balanced risk pool in order to determine a reasonable premium calculation. What you want to do is you want to attract, in health insurance at least, in that individual market, you want to make sure that you're attracting healthier risk to balance the unhealthy people who are naturally going to gravitate towards these ad hoc purchases of individual products in the marketplace.
Lisa, would you mind if I interject and tell the audience that before you came to the law school, you were a senior vice president and general counsel and corporate compliance officer for Blue Cross Blue Shield, and has done a tremendous amount of work in the insurance industry. So her comments hopefully are highlighted in that context. Go ahead. I just hope I didn't break your train of thought, but I thought it was so important what you were saying. I wanted them to know your background.
Not a problem. It certainly provides context for my insurer orientation.
Well, no, your knowledge and your experience,
So anyway, what we're trying to do in the individual insurance market is we're trying to establish a balanced risk pool. And so you need to have products that attract healthier risk, and they need to be reasonably priced. And you need to guard against this concept of adverse selection, where only those people who immediately need health insurance and access to health services are going to be purchasing that product. In other words, you want to have a period of time where you collect premium before people actually start submitting claims, and that creates a balanced risk pool. So establishing a balanced risk pool is absolutely essential to your ability to maintain affordability of premiums. And Congress was mindful of that when they developed the Affordable Care Act, and it has so many different moving pieces, all of which are really interdependent when we talk about the markets and what the cause and effect is between minor changes in either the product design, such as the scope of benefits that your product offers, or the cost shares that you impose upon the consumers. Those all have a direct impact on the premiums that you charge. And so when Congress set out to establish significant market reform in the individual markets, they addressed these very important basic propositions of insurance law to make sure that they were not unintentionally creating the consequence of market instability. And once you start tinkering with any aspect of the member cost shares or the imbalance with regard to the scope of coverage in the products, you are interfering in what Congress established to be a level playing field with regard to the markets that are established under the statute. And indeed, that seems to be exactly where this current administration is headed, in an effort to introduce what the current administration calls additional consumer choice, which is believed to be important in order to lower the surging premium cost. The plan, as he articulated earlier this month, is to introduce 3 different new elements into that individual marketplace. The first are association health plans. The second are the short-term interim policies that are already called for under the statute that were intended to be a gap filler should any one individual lose access to coverage and not be able to satisfy the mandate. The product was intended to be a very low-cost alternative to the products that were sold on the exchange. The idea that the president has now advanced is, well, these are already built into the structure of the Affordable Care Act. Why not expand them to provide a lower cost alternative to the products that are regulated and already administered on the exchange? And then the third idea is to expand the notion of health savings accounts that are intended to offset the cost shifting that goes on, particularly in the employer group market, where employers, in their effort to better manage increasing healthcare premiums over time, have tended to increase the cost shift or the rate of shifting of some of that premium cost onto the backs of their employees. But it all works out if you are enrolled in an employer group health plan, because you also have access to tax-advantaged health savings account opportunities that allow you this extraordinary triple tax benefit if you are enrolled in a high deductible plan. So when we talk about what's going on in the current markets, the people who obtain, the majority of Americans who obtain their health insurance through their employers are pretty well situated. They've got a pretty good gig going on between the amount of the costs that are borne by the employer, the premium cost, and then the ability to put away tax advantage savings to cover their deductibles and their cost shares under their health plans. So most of the commentary that we're concerned about in the marketplace today, again, is in that individual market. The premiums have gone up. So why have the premiums gone up? Well, a little bit of history. The individual markets became operational January 1st, 2014. And so we've had precisely 3 years worth of claims experience to analyze, to understand, and to help inform adjustments with regard to both the product design and the cost of those products. The market, ironically, in 2017 is beginning to stabilize, finally. And part of the reason that it's taken so long is because there's a long time lag between the time when the services are incurred and the time that you have finalized claims data to analyze. So typically for a benefit year that begins in January, you don't even know what your prior year's claims experience was until around July, immediately before that January start date. And your prior claims history is going to be the best indicator of whether or not you have a well-balanced product that you're selling in the marketplace. In other words, you have a product where the mix of benefits in terms of the scope of the benefits and the cost shares are such that you can reasonably predict what the future costs are going to be based upon the prior year's experience. Well, when you add into that all of the uncertainty that's going on around, well, what's going to happen through this regulatory review and replace process where the current administration is all about 60-day timelines under presidential executive orders directing his various departments to go into all of the regulations with regard to, in this instance, healthcare, and reinterpret those regulations within the confines of the law. And I'll just conclude by noting that this is permissive. Under a Supreme Court decision, the Chevron case, great deference is given by the courts to the regulatory agencies' interpretations of the law, so long as those interpretations are not arbitrary and they reasonably follow the statute. So certainly I expect to see considerable reinterpretation of the thousands of pages of regulations that support the Affordable Care Act, and if nothing else, they're going to create significant market instability.
Thank you. I think we're going to have some questions after all of that part. Thank you. We're also very lucky to have with us tonight James Chip Falahi, who is Senior Vice President, Legal and Legislative Affairs for Bronson Healthcare Group. He joined Bronson in 1987 and has more than 40 years of experience in healthcare law and legislation. He's been named one of the best lawyers in America in healthcare. He's a frequent speaker about healthcare policy and reform, and he's a founding member, past president, and fellow of the Healthcare Law Section of the State Bar of Michigan, and past president of the Michigan Society of Hospital Attorneys. He's also one of 2 hospital representatives on the state's Certificate of Need Commission, which is a very, very important job, and he served as chairman of the commission from 2011 to 2014. He's a board member of the Michigan Health and Hospital Association and of the 340B Health and Organization of over 1,100 public and private nonprofit hospitals and health systems throughout the United States that participate in the 340B drug discount program. He has an undergraduate degree from University of Michigan and a Juris Doctorate from Wayne State University. Would you like to give us some insight on maybe what other hospitals and healthcare providers are doing to respond to the uncertainty in the health insurance markets?
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight for a topic that for some can be really dull and boring. For others can be very exasperating. In the healthcare business, it's all of the above. So people wonder, Bronson, as you know, it's right across the street. So people wonder, what is it that's going on within Bronson, within other hospitals, to deal with the uncertainty, the Affordable Care Act, the repeal and replace? What version are we on, okay? What goes on within hospitals? It's been my pleasure over the last few years to talk to many healthcare providers. I get to talk to our nurses again in a couple weeks. And my message to them and to you is what's going on in Washington or Lansing or any other state capital or Washington really has no impact at all and should not have any impact at all on the bedside care. That hospitals should worry about right care, right place, right time, quality, access, and cost. If you're a nurse, if you're a physician, if you're a respiratory therapist, your job is not to worry about what's going on within Washington. Your job is to take care of that patient that's in front of you as best you can. Do high quality, deliver high quality, high customer service, do your best job. That is what any healthcare provider needs to do, regardless of what comes out of a state capital or a nation's capital. Because when you get down to it, what do we all want? We want quality health care. We want it at a good cost, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's what we want, and so that's what I stress to our healthcare providers, physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, physical therapists, social workers. Deliver that care. Deliver that high quality. Deliver that access. Deliver the right care at the right place at the right time. Now, let's talk about quality for a second. Congressman Stupak talked about that. Transparency. Hospitals are getting into the transparency game. I say game, and I mean that not jokingly. But hospitals need to do a better job. Doctors need to do a better job. Everybody needs to do a better job on transparency. Admittedly, it's tough in healthcare to say to someone, okay, I'm going in for this procedure. What's it going to cost? That's like saying to a car mechanic, my car has a problem. Don't open the hood yet, but tell me what's wrong with it and what it's going to cost. We can't guarantee what we're going to find when we get inside of that human body. But I think we need to do our best to make those prices that we can anticipate more transparent. As you heard, I'm on the board of the Michigan Hospital Association. I'm on a subcommittee where we're working right now on a brand new website that will come out at the end of this year. It's going to be called Verify My Care. Verify My Care. So the hospitals in Michigan, the 150 so hospitals, are going to be submitting data to this. One of the issues with transparency sites up till now has been it may be just Medicare patients. It may be just Medicaid patients. This will be much more transparent and much broader group. So I would urge you to go there to get some of your clinical quality questions. Payment. Mr. Stupak talked about it. Right now, it's a fee-for-service system. Luckily, in Michigan, we're in a certificate of need state. So if you're a physician and you want to buy an MRI and put it in your office, you can't do that unless you get state approval. But in a fee-for-service system, it's the more you do, the more you make, all right? We talk about moving from a fee-for-service to a fee-for-value, pay for performance. We're all for that. We agree. It's going to take a while to get there. Right now, about 90 to 95% of the payments we get are fee-for-service. some of the bundled payment models that CMS was looking at, where we would say, okay, for a knee procedure, hospital, anesthesiologist, physical therapist, orthopedic surgeons, there's one payment that comes in from CMS. You decide how you divvy it up. Those bundled payment models were working, but under former Secretary Price, they were done away with. So we would like to put those back in place. They work. They get quality care. Also, let's talk about access. To us in the hospital business, that emergency department at Bronson across the street, we see about 100,000 patients a year. We don't turn away anybody for their ability to pay or lack of ability to pay. When a physician or a nurse is treating a patient, they don't care, they don't know what kind of money they've got. We don't do a wallet biopsy on patients before we put them in the emergency department or send them up to the floor. They're going to get the best care we can deliver regardless of what kind of money they got or the money they lack. One thing we have to be cognizant of, though, as hospitals is access means having the necessary providers to get the care that people need. And in these day and age, it's more the primary care providers. So we're making a concerted effort to get to and hire additional primary care providers and what some people call mid-level or advanced practitioner nurses, physician assistants and nurse practitioners, because for a significant part of what ails us, an NP or a PA can handle that initially and turf it, if needed, to an MD or a DO. So we're working on that. And let me last talk about cost. It's a big issue. We focus on cost efficiencies every single day because we need to deliver the best care we can at the right place, the right time, for the right cost. So we're constantly looking at ways to bring costs down. We have to, because that's responsive to the market, that's responsive to our patients. At best, hospitals would love to make a 3% margin. Now, if you're a for-profit insurance company or you're a medical device company, you would be aghast at a 3% stock margin, all right? That's good in the healthcare business. You need a margin. Why do you need a margin? Do you want to expand services, recruit physicians, bring in the latest technology, centralize functions when you can? So you need to make some money to plow it back in for that improvement. So with that, I'll conclude. I'll be glad to answer any other questions you've got. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, and we are also very happy to have with us Dr. Tyler Gibb. And beyond teaching at Western's Medical School here, Dr. Gibb is Vice Chair of the Institutional Review Board. He completed Clinical Ethical Fellowship at the University of California, Los Angeles Health System Ethics Center. He earned his PhD in Healthcare Ethics from St. Louis University and obtained a law degree from the St. Louis University School of Law, where he was editor-in-chief of the Journal of Health, Law, and Policy. I think we know what he likes. He has authored a number of publications, including peer-reviewed and law review articles on clinical bioethics, health law, and research ethics. So take it away, Dr. Gibb.
Great, thank you. So we've heard a lot about different stakeholders involved in healthcare and healthcare reform. And often we focus on the patient's experience, the providers or the payer's experience. But the stakeholder that we often don't hear about, and one that I think has a voice that needs to be heard more clearly in these debates, is the perspective of the provider. So I am on the faculty here at this medical school. I have the privilege of working very closely throughout my professional life with physicians in training, and people who are working very hard to become physicians. And I consider that to be a great privilege because of the sacrifices that I see them making. So when I teach them about what their obligations are as a profession, often we talk about the social contract that they are entering into to become physicians. We tell them from day one that by putting on that white coat, you have promised something very sacred to society. And in return, society is promising things to you. We expect physicians to be competent, to be compassionate, to be well educated. We expect them to deliver the right type of care at the right time. We often forget what our obligations are to healthcare providers. And one of the things that we promise them implicitly through this social contract is a functioning system. And right now, our healthcare system is not functioning to the benefit of our healthcare providers. So I would say that our healthcare providers have a legitimate expectation. I know that we'll probably talk about universal healthcare being a right or a human right, maybe in the question and answer, but I'll use the phrase a legitimate expectation of us as a society. And we are failing in providing that functional system. We're failing on our side of the social contract. In the healthcare literature right now, physician burnout, healthcare provider burnout is a hot topic. We are talking about the impact that burnout has on the level of care being able to be provided in certain areas of the country, and also the impact on the workforce in general. Burnout is often defined as emotional exhaustion, a lack of job satisfaction, and depersonalization. A 2011 study by the Mayo Clinic and the AMA found that 51% of our healthcare providers are experiencing burnout. They redid the study, and this is a survey of about 7,000 healthcare providers. They redid the study 3 years later, thinking certainly that's not the case. And they found that 63% of those people polled were experiencing symptoms of burnout. Suicide rates among male physicians is 1.4 times higher than their age-adjusted general population. Physician suicide by females is 2.2%, or times, not percent, times greater for female providers. Incidence of major depressive episodes by residents is 28%. Compare that to 7 to 8% of similarly aged individuals in the general population. Depression in medical schools is estimated to be between 25 and 30% of all of our healthcare learners. Again, compared to age-adjusted population of between 4 and 5%. Clearly, we are doing something wrong. The way that we have structured our system, the way that we have structured our educational environment is failing our healthcare providers at all levels. I would propose and strongly argue that this is or should be seen as a public health crisis. If there was something, if there was a disease or if there was a product that was increasing your rate of suicide between 4 and 5% over your national cohort, the CDC would be very heavily involved in that. The FDA would be involved in that. But we are not looking at the way that our healthcare system and education system are exacerbating the stress that is being provided on the healthcare providers. There are individual stress, there are professional stressors, and there are system stressors. And I think that we as individuals who are trying to help shape incoming physicians and trying to create a structure that provides healthcare for the most number of people, we also must not forget the people who are actually providing the care. And I think that we should all feel morally indicted at the rate of which we are burning out our healthcare providers. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have a few questions here that the audience has posed, and let's see where we will start. Mr. Falahi, I'm wondering, what do you think a healthcare law would look like if healthcare providers designed it? They were not fed these questions, as you know, ahead of time.
Assuming the Court of Appeals would let the law go through.
Won't be us.
If providers were designing the law.
We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. If providers were designing the law, I think at first they would say, okay, let's look at tort reform, medical malpractice, professional negligence, that kind of thing. And that's been discussed ad infinitum, but I think that'd be one of the first issues they would look at, would be what do we do to make sure that if we deliver what we think is good care, we're not the deep pocket. Many times physicians will say, not incorrectly, the patient comes to me expecting me to deliver the silver pill that solves everything, and that they'll walk out of there as Superman or Superwoman. That won't happen. And because that doesn't happen doesn't mean I, as the provider, made a mistake or did something wrong. So I think that would be one of the first issues to look at, some sort of tort reform. Another issue I'm aware of, and I know Tyler is too, is the issue of feudal care. As we get older and we have the ability to keep ourselves alive for a longer period of time, physicians have just an awful time saying, okay, grandma is 96. Does she really need this procedure? Is it futile? Is this something that if I as a physician provide to grandma will benefit her? Or is it just something that the kids want grandma to have? So the issue, I think, of feudal care, and we deal with it all the time. I've worked with Tyler on issues like that before. We had one yesterday, an issue of feudal care. So I think that's another issue that providers would work on. And I'll close with this, I think, and I touched upon it briefly, is payment. How do physicians get paid? Is it through a bundled system? Is it through value-based system, fee for value, pay for performance? I think physicians are more and more keen on that model and like that model because it rewards those physicians who are the best physicians. That's how this society works anyway. So I would think physicians would incorporate that if they could draft the law.
Thank you. Would any of the rest of you like to chime in on that aspect? All right. This is an interesting question. What are the public misconceptions and roadblocks to changing our healthcare system to a universal healthcare system? I'm suspecting Congressman Stupak might want to begin on that one.
Sure, I'll begin. But remember I said back in 1970 we had Martha Griffiths from Michigan here did universal health care, paid for by with increased tax revenues and also payments from the general fund. Also that same year was Medicare for All. Medicare for All has become real popular thanks to our current president. And I said after we passed the Affordable Care Act that, and I still believe that within 10 years you'll be in a single payer system. You just can't continue to go at the rate we're going and at the cost that is costing the American people. And not just American people, but government and employers and everyone else. I mean, as the president says, and he's finding out, and that's probably why there has been no plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, it really is a complex system. But the value we're getting in return of health quality is not what we pay for. We pay for the best, and unfortunately, in many stages, we're not receiving it. And I think that a system of a single payer system is going to be a much more equitable, much more just, and a better system for the American people. But it is politically unpopular. My district is northern Michigan, and we border Canada. And they grumble about having to wait for elective surgery, but they get their surgeries when they need it. They would not trade that system, even though you hear all these stories that they'd like to get rid of it. All the evidence I have seen, just the opposite. Why? Because it provides them financial security and health security. So I think a single system, single payer system, we'll see one. Give it another 10 years. The market forces will force us into a single system.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? I think so.
I'll step in. So when we look at the principles that undergird the healthcare system, we often talk about autonomy, freedom of choice, respecting the dignity of our patients and our providers. We talk about doing no harm, doing good, doing beneficent things, and social justice issues. Those are kind of where American ethos regarding at least medical healthcare ethics ends. Interestingly, if you go across the pond, there are societies that incorporate a fifth principle of medical ethics that we do not have here. We don't talk about very much. And that's one of community solidarity. Community solidarity is respected just as much as autonomy is respected here. And part of it, there's a long historical development of why we value rugged individualism over solidarity. But the idea that having a community that takes care of each other and whose values are placed upon the benefit of somebody else, even if I do have to sacrifice, that's not incompatible with high levels of healthcare. And it's done successfully in other places across the country, or across the world.
I would agree that the current cost trajectory with regard to healthcare costs is unsustainable moving forward, but I think we have a choice to make. Too much of the healthcare economy, we have a significant portion of our overall GDP as a country invested in that health sector. And so I think we have to make some sacrifices. We have to make some choices before we get to the point of universal health care. Are we willing to rein in the cost at the expense of growing the economy? And we're definitely not there yet, but I'm heartened to think that perhaps someday in the not too distant future we may get to a better system.
I'll add my comments. When someone asks me to try to summarize healthcare in 4 words, what I like to say is it's infinite expectations and finite dollars. And that's what you've got with every health reform proposal out there. And the same exists with universal health care. There may be infinite expectations for it. Somehow you got to pay for it. And will Americans be ready and willing to do that? Tyler talked about across the pond. I was across the pond for the last 2 weeks or so, and we were in Germany, and we were on a tour, and one of our guides, who's from Germany, had a father who needed a knee replacement. And under the German system, they said, well, we'll see you in 7 months. And then they said, but do you have the private insurance? Yes, I do. We'll see you in 2 days. So that's the issue we're going to have to grapple with. Anytime we have a healthcare system, sometimes they may have layered onto it other benefits or other special services. But I think it's always going to boil down to infinite expectations and the finite dollars.
If you go back to a single payer system, let's call it Medicare for all, since that seems to have picked up a little bit. I think there's 16 Democratic sponsors in the U.S. Senate for Medicare for all. The cost to administer that program is 2%. When you go into other healthcare systems or insurance, it's 17 to 20%. If you take 2% of the health care and the administrative costs, according to President Clinton, is about $400 billion a year. What does that buy? How much health does that buy you? Nothing. And the other thing about whenever you start talking about single payer or private, I've always been of the belief, again, that health care is all right, but I also believe that everyone has to be participating in the program, the individual mandate, if you will. Because when you deal with health care, if you don't have everybody covered, and if everybody's not part of the system, all you're doing is shifting that cost somewhere else in the healthcare field. So we all have to be in the system, and we all have to be participating in that system. You know, otherwise, it's just going to continue like we are right now, cost shifting from this policy to that policy. And if you, I introduced this to my last term, and I think my colleagues certified that I was nuts. But look how we pay for health care. Okay, you have your health care policy, right? You pay it for it on your automobile insurance, right? There's a big movement right now to change no fault. And I was going to resolve it. We also pay it for at your house. You pay it under workers' compensation. You pay health care on premises liability. Every aspect of our society is paying for health care in a different way. But it all comes down to health care. If I have to have my knee replaced, as that gentleman in Germany did, What difference does it make whether I was in the automobile or slipped and fell at my home or my knee wore out from my days in the state police? All I'm asking for is fix my knee. Why do I have to have 4 or 5 different parts of my society chip in case I slip and fall at home or I'm in an auto accident? It doesn't, if you're talking about quality of health care and healthcare outcomes, shouldn't make any difference whether it was an auto accident, whether I slipped and fell at home, or my knee wore out from my days in state police. I should get my knee replaced. Why do I have to pay for it 6 different ways? Not to mention your healthcare premium. So I think we got to get into a single payer system where we're all into it and we're not shifting costs around.
Are there situations where people are denied care and refused any sort of treatment because of their inability to pay?
Yes.
Okay.
That was constant. That was the one of the big battles in the patient's Bill of Rights. You know, when I was in that automobile accident, I had to be in network, so they'd take me to the hospital that my insurance covered, not the closest hospital. Okay? And that's part of just patient bill. That's just basic right. I'm in a serious auto accident. I want to go to the nearest hospital. And you have it all the time. You have cost shifting. If I come into the hospital and I'm on a Medicaid card, it might be sort of hard to see. They'll take care of me, stabilize me, but I bet my follow-up treatment may not be there.
Well, another aspect of that might be where does personal...
Go ahead. I know Chip wants to jump in.
Go right ahead.
Let me respectfully disagree.
Here we go.
Knowing what goes on across the street, whether you have no-CAID, Medicaid, Medicare, Aetna care, whatever, you're going to get the same level of care. I know what Bronson does. Those nurses, those physicians, they don't know whether I'm on Medicaid or Medicare or have private insurance. Doesn't matter. They're going to get the same level of care. There's one level of care, and there should be one level of care, regardless of what you've got in your wallet or your purse or what you don't have in your wallet or your purse.
Now, just so to clarify, as I said, when you go to the emergency room, they'll stabilize, they'll take care of you, but if you need more, it's going to be dependent on in-network, out-of-network, PPO, whatever it might be, HMO, whatever it might be. So, I mean, I always felt that if you're in that accident, go to the closest one. And when we did the patient Bill of Rights, and we tried to pass it and we couldn't get it passed, that was one of the biggest horror stories we had all the time from patients throughout the country. That ambulance would take a quick stop and go on somewhere else because they didn't have the right credentials.
Well, a lot
Not
of
only that, they also want to check your citizenship nowadays too. You don't do that, I know, but in some parts of the country, they do that.
I think what's important to note, though, is that whether it happens or it doesn't happen, there's a perception that it happens. And that is a problem for it's an identity issue. It's an identity issue for providers and patients and the way that they perceive they're being cared for. And that's something that I think is tragic if they are being provided the same type of care, they don't believe that they're entitled to the same type of care because of their insurance status or non-status.
Well, the same thing happens in the law many times when there's public defenders versus private lawyers hired for criminal cases. And as lawyers and attorneys, we would contend that public defenders and appointed counsel do a superb job. In fact, much of the time, they're the best choice of all. So we can segue between the medical and the law schools on that kind of information. This is part of this kind of context of the conversation. How does personal responsibility fit into any of all of this? I mean, let's say we have a lifelong smoker and they have lung cancer. How far do we, as a society, as a country, have an obligation to take care of someone with that nature of illness, or do we just leave them on their own? That's an ethical question maybe Dr. Gibb might have some insight on.
That's easy. To answer your specific question, do we leave them alone? No, we don't. I mean, that's unthinkable that person would be without any type of care. What type of treatment they have had throughout their life, I think, dictates in a lot of ways what their end of life will look like. And if somebody comes to the hospital and has end stage lung cancer and hasn't been treated since the time that they were a child and has been routinely denied access to preventative, maintenance, all type of treatment throughout their lives, I mean, setting aside even the educational and other types of social service access deficiencies that any of our patients do have, do they have a moral responsibility for their own health? Yes, of course they do. But at what point and in how many different ways have we failed that person as a society on their path to coming in with a terminal condition that hasn't been cared for?
So how high will taxes need to rise in order to pay for cradle-to-grave care? Is that one for you, Professor?
I was actually going to respond to
Oh,
that
I'm
question.
sorry. You want to go ahead?
No, I just wanted to.
We have so many good questions, and I'm trying to,
I just wanted to make a note that with regard to tobacco usage specifically,
I'm sorry, to what?
tobacco usage
Tobacco,
specifically, and personal responsibility, that is one of the anomalies, I believe, within the Affordable Care Act, in that insurance companies were allowed to charge 1.5 times more premium to applicants for individual policies who are smokers. And that was really the only medical rating factor that was allowed under the statute. So we have assigned some moral responsibility as a country for tobacco usage in the form of a higher cost for your access to your health insurance.
Thank you. Now, you want to think about that other question? How high will we have to raise taxes? Will we be able as a country to afford to pay for cradle-to-grave care, which I think is a concern of everyone, is how much is this all going to cost us?
Well, again, you want everyone to have access to quality, affordable health care throughout their life. But one of the things we did do in the Affordable Care Act, and maybe Chip knows this statistic better than I do, but I think it's the last 6 months of your life you use up 90% of all the health care costs that you did previous to that time. And in the Affordable Care Act, we put in end-of-life counseling. According to the Tea Party, that was the death squads. Remember when we killed Grandma off? No such thing. And unfortunately, during the healthcare debate, and we mentioned it because proves a point in the book, my mother-in-law died during the middle of the healthcare debate unexpectedly. But we were so thankful to have a physician talk to us. And I felt even better about knowing that we would actually pay the guy, because they don't pay you for end-of-life counseling. We do now under the Affordable Care Act because we don't kill Grandma. We try to help the family make a decision about what should we do. You extend that life, but what is the quality of life that person going to have? Those are the questions that we all have to ask each other, whether you're a young person from some rare disease or a more older senior citizen, as my mother-in-law was. Those are tough decisions. And as consumers, and that's why we talk about advertising what it costs for this or for that, at least give you some idea. And you're not going to value a life based upon how much it's going to cost a procedure. It's what's the quality of life that person's going to have. And I think as a society, we're starting to come to grips with it. And actually, to tell you the truth, the quality of life issues we talked about, end-of-life counseling, actually was a proposal from the Republican Party and was a good proposal, and we accepted it.
And let me piggyback on that. End-of-life care, advanced care planning, it goes by many, many names. Those are tough conversations with the physician and the family. I talked to a physician today at lunch about those conversations, and he said, Chip, those are hard. I don't like to do them. But more and more and more physicians realize, like with Bart's mother-in-law, it needs to happen. It's best when it does happen. And whether you've got an advanced care directive or not, meet with the family, meet with the patient to say, what are your wishes here? And honor those wishes as best you can. And we're trying to do in the healthcare community a much better effort, especially here locally, to say to physicians, to providers, have that crucial conversation about advanced care planning. It doesn't get to the cost question, but it gets to the care that we all will require and want and choose at the end of our life.
Specifically on the cost question, if you look at the structure of the Affordable Care Act and the thresholds at which Congress determined that American applicants in the insurance market needed financial assistance, the assumption was that if the health care premium exceeded 10% of your household taxable income, you needed help. It was not affordable. And so as you add more cost, unless you're simultaneously significantly increasing the wages that you pay people, you're going to consistently exceed that threshold, if indeed we acknowledge that that is the appropriate threshold for unaffordability of health insurance in America.
Part of the failure that we see, or part of the reason that why this end-of-life conversation happens often at the physician's office, or unfortunately more often in the ICUs, is because we, as a society, have lost the ability to see somebody die in our home. There's been a death of dying in America. We are uncomfortable with the idea that, number one, anybody is going to die, and number two, what that dying looks like. So I advocate for not having these conversations with your physician first, to have them with your family first. Because if your family doesn't know how the hell you want to die, how's the doctor going to know? I tried to do this in my own life, and when my father-in-law turned 65, I gave him a blank advance directive. He didn't think that was as useful as I thought it was a great idea. But he's now 72, and we haven't had the conversation yet, but we tried.
Well, you know, when we talk about costs, that's one of the big things we try to drive down in the Affordable Care Act. And you heard me talk about when I was giving my comments earlier about between 2000 and 2007, wages went up 4.6%, but yet health insurance premiums went up 78.2%, and we're pricing ourselves out of the market. When we passed the Affordable Care Act, the average median income in the 1st Congressional District was $38,700. The average family health insurance policy was $13,375. That was 34% of the family's income. Take out another third for taxes, and then plus you're supposed to have a home and feed your family and everything else. It could not be done. But one of the things we tried doing, and I could kick myself, I should have had this chart done up. This was a chart we had, and it's probably still true today. When we talked about going from fee-for-service to quality-based outcome, let's try to even up this map. Reimbursement for health care is pegged really to Medicare, okay? Every insurance company, what we pay, it's pegged to what's Medicare paying. All right? And listen to these stats. In Miami, Florida, the average Medicare recipient is $16,351 per Medicare enrollee. You say, well, that's Miami because they're all old people. Well, that's not the situation because the 1st Congressional District has the 5th oldest senior or 5th oldest age population in the country. Okay? In Marquette, which is in the Upper Peninsula, we reimbursed them $6,100 for every Medicare patient. The one who had the lowest in the country was Honolulu. And they've had universal health care in Hawaii for some time, but yet they keep their cost the lowest. The nation's average was $8,300 per Medicare recipient. So how do you go from the $6,100 in Marquette to the, you can't tell me the quality of health care or the services I'm receiving in Miami, Florida at $16,300 is so much better than I receive in Marquette. I submit I get better care in Marquette because they know who I am. Not because I'm the congressman, but they know you. We're a small community, so you get better turnout. And this is based on Medicare, but that's 40 years of working out. And you see where the cost was in the South, was in Southern California, Northeast. Those were the big costs. The upper Midwest where we live, we were below average. And the Mayo Clinic and others advocate it. If we do go to quality-based outcome as opposed to fee-for-service, we can start to even up those structures. So some parts of the country is not getting $16,000 per patient, and their one's not getting $5,500. So those were some of the things we tried to do. Again, the Affordable Care Act, has never been fully implemented. It's never been fully funded. It's never been tried. As soon as we passed it, unfortunately in 2011 or 2010 election, new party took over and all they've been talking about is rhetoric about repealing. So these policy issues, they are complex, and I appreciate the input from everybody up here because we're all trying to do the same thing for provide quality, affordable health care. But even the president's starting to realize a lot more complex than he even realized.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, but we're already over a little bit, so I think I'll take the opportunity to thank our panelists very, very much. Obviously, this question is not only one that is one of the most challenging things our country has ever had to face, but it's so stupendously complicated and complex. It's like having a jigsaw puzzle where none of the pieces really fit together. And it's going to take the minds and the hearts and the courage of really smart, dedicated, and caring, not only leaders, but politicians, and probably everyone, like people in this particular room, to help us get through this crisis and give Americans the kind of health care that we all need and deserve. And I think that all of us, no matter what side you're on the aisle, believe that's the case. So I thank you again to our panelists. I want to thank the Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine for hosting us. I want to thank Thomas M. Cooley, Western Michigan University Law School for having us. And the delicious food was thanks to Levine & Levine, a law firm that sponsored that aspect of it. We have one last question that I get to ask. Bart Stupak, have you considered running for president? And if so, do you need a running mate?
No.
Well, that didn't take long. Please join us in the lobby, and we have a book signing. And I seriously, this is a really, really interesting book, and I think that you would all enjoy it, and I hope that you go out and talk to our congressman, and court is adjourned.